The lesser of two evils is still evil. This is a catchphrase that I use from time to time in conversations about veganism and animal rights with people in real life, face to face. Very often as vegans, we're presented with a contrast between two scenarios, both of which we would consider evil. For example, well, what if we simply make changes to the way pigs are raised so that they are not castrated in such a horrendous way, so that their teeth are not pulled out, so that they live in pens where they get to roll in the mud instead of being directly on concrete. And some vegans feel it's tremendously important to pretend, as Gary Francione does, that abolitionism is the only way to approach the issue, and that if we admit degrees of difference, if we admit that one is in any way more or less evil than the other, then somehow we have already lost the battle. What this leads to psychologically and politically is a tremendously fragile, somewhat hysterical and shrill approach to animal rights and veganism, and it makes it completely impossible to cooperate with and collaborate with people who may be really like-minded, have similar objectives and values, but who may be, for example, hunters, who may be Indigenous people, the Cree and Ojibwe here in Canada, who are often very proud of continuing their hunting traditions, but who may share concerns about preserving forest habitat or about opposing the great excesses of factory farming, let's say vivisection on a university campus, like my university campus here, or university campus I was at before in Saskatchewan that really had a significant number of Indigenous people, First Nations people, Cree and Ojibwe included. So some vegans today in 2016 really valorize, really glamorize, really propound the notion that we should be inflexible, we should stick to an abolitionist definition of morality and not admit of differences of degree, of saying this is worse than that. This is evil, but that is even more evil. And I do not see any tactical advantage in this, and I've already alluded to the tactical disadvantages. Instead, what I'm suggesting to you is that it's really useful to be able to say the difference between evil and another form of evil is something I can recognize. But if we have to choose, then the lesser of two evils is still evil. Now, in a video I posted just within the last few days, you'll see that I discussed the rise and fall of basically the wilderness itself, wildness, as a paradigm within animal rights, vegetarian activism, vegan activism. And basically, it's really peculiar to me that from my perspective, the opposition to domestication itself, the opposition to the domestication of animals in principle, has disappeared from animal rights and vegan activism. Instead now, guys like Gary Francione himself, he shows off him cuddling his pet dog. There was a time when, again, this is like really 15 years ago, the insistence was instead on, respecting animals, meaning respecting their habitat, respecting their independence, respecting that a shark in nature will kill and eat human beings, a tiger, an elephant, that we should be making room and planning the future of our society so that animals can live in wilderness. But in the sense, the baseline for what is a dog is not man's best friend. This paradigm was also insisting that we regard a dog naturally as a wild hunter, as a predator. And indeed, wild dogs, they'll attack you and try to kill you and eat you. Still today, wild dogs in Africa, in a few parts of Africa, you can still get torn apart by wild dogs. I have been attacked by dogs in Southeast Asia, but none of them were wild. Maybe they were feral, but not quite wild. Anyway, but this really was refusing to take the view of animals as a toy, as a plaything, as something to be domesticated and cuddled. And this really has disappeared today. Apart from the greater emphasis on consumerism, health, diet, weight loss, lifestyle, seemingly unchallenged, the cuddly lamb, the cuddly cute pig, that's become of central symbolic significance to veganism today. And pigs in the wild, they're actually pretty terrifying. If you run into an adult boar in the jungle, You can indeed be attacked by a wild pig. Even if you're not attacked by one, you just encounter one, they can be hundreds and hundreds of pounds. Big, muscular, defiant creatures. Even, actually very few people alive have seen wild chickens. Chickens really living in the jungle, not reliant on human beings to feed them, and what their behavior is like and how they act. The symbol of French nationalism, until very recently, they still have statues up and flags with this, was the proud chicken. This notion of a cock, of a male chicken, as a defiant, violent, proud animal. This has disappeared from awareness because we now think of chickens on the one hand, of course, in factory farms. But veganism is counterposing to that these days. They're saying, a chicken can also be a loving pet. Is that the point? Is that really how we should challenge the paradigm of factory farms? Or should we think about chickens, pigs, dogs, etc., also in the same terms that we think of lions and tigers, as animals where their wild form is what we ought to respect? Now, the old approach of 15 years ago also had very serious disadvantages. Among the advantages, you can say, was that it sincerely cared about Indigenous people. It sincerely cared about First Nations people like the Cree and Ojibwe, Native people in Papua New Guinea, Indigenous people of Australia. That was really sincere. Today's veganism seems to have no interest whatsoever, which again, if you've been familiar with animal rights activism, that's a change. It's a subtle, strange change in the underpinnings of what's been going on politically here. I care about First Nations. If you look through this YouTube channel, I used to study Cree and Ojibwe as language, something I personally have cared about for many, many years. But it's almost treated today as a totally separate issue from veganism and animal rights. The disadvantage, which I think guys like Francione would complain about, I think most vegans today would be shocked by, was that old-fashioned, more primitivistic, more anarchistic form of animal rights and vegetarian activism, because back then the word vegan wasn't really popular yet. People would just talk about vegetarianism as part of the movement. The disadvantage is that it's soft on hunting. It would be totally opposed to factory farming, angrily, militantly against this brutal factory-like exploitation of animals. But they were willing to admit of a difference. There was a difference between a pig that lives its whole life wild and free in the forest with all of the joys and miseries of being a real, authentic wild animal. A pig that one day suddenly encounters a human being with a crossbow, the human being kills that pig and eats it. That, from the old-fashioned perspective, really was qualitatively different from factory farming, the sort of disaggregated cycle of people buying meat as a finished product in a shop and not feeling any responsibility for killing the animal. It's a much different set of psychological priorities, as well as a different approach to political provocation or propaganda, shall we say. And today this has almost been inverted. I think vegans today regard hunters as the most despicable form of meat eaters. They regard hunters as wealthy, bored people who are more cruel, who are more perverse, who are more evil than someone who just buys pork as a finished product in the shop. And now along with this comes, as already alluded to, the refusal to admit of degrees of difference. People who feel very strongly that you cannot sacrifice your moral high ground in claiming that all killing of animals is equally evil, that all sources of meat are equally evil, that literally the Inuit, also known as the Eskimos, are native people in Canada, that when the Inuit go and kill a seal or kill a whale sitting in a small wooden boat with a harpoon, and yes, today it's a steel harpoon, yes, today it may be an electrical harpoon, shot out of a cannon or what have you, but nevertheless, that is morally equivalent to or morally worse than factory farming. So, again, these changes, they're profound, they're subtle, they took place over time, and with all of them I can see different advantages and disadvantages. But paradoxically enough, it was back in the old days, back when Anarcho-Primitivism was more of a big deal, back when there was more of this positive connection to indigenous peoples, their political struggles, which again is kind of soft on hunting, but back when ecology was much more linked to those political movements, it was at that time, back then, that was when vegetarians and ecologists seemed to really care about vivisection. I don't know why. Vivisection has also kind of really dropped down in priority compared to lifestyle activism, lose weight, look great, wear a bikini, ride a bicycle, but also compared to the few bits and pieces that you can point to today and really say this is political veganism or this is political animal rights activism. So look, as always, folks, I'm not trying to sell you a diet book. I'm not trying to sell you handmade jewelry. I'm not even trying to sell you an ideology. This channel is not monetized. There are no advertisements. And I'm not telling you what to think. But I am telling you this is still something really worth thinking about.